Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part one of three of recorded lecture on growth and crisis in colonial society. And so, in this first part, we're going to be talking about really immigration, the cultural diversity, as the United States has well, throughout its history, has had quite a few immigrant groups coming through, and especially in the colonial time period, by the nature of colonies and so forth. And then we'll also talk about westward expansion and how land is going to become more and more short in the eastern seaboard and so forth. And that's going to lead to more and more settlers going onto the frontier. And as you can imagine, going to cause conflict with Native Americans. So first off, let's talk about immigrants. So tens of thousands of European migrants, primarily Highland Scots. So if you've ever seen, Braveheart or something like that, those are Scottish Highlanders. Also, Scots, Irish, and Germans swelled the population of Britain's North American settlements from about 400,000 in 1720 to almost 2 million by 1765. The reason why they were coming, chance of a better opportunity, and really the great availability of land that's happening at this time. The rapid increase in the number of white settlers and enslaved Africans transformed the character of life in every region of British America. Long settled towns in New England became densely settled and then overcrowded. So as you can imagine, they're going to have to go west. Antagonistic ethnic and religious communities jostled uneasily with one another in the middle Atlantic colonies, and the influx of thousands of Celtic and German migrants altered the social and political landscape in the backcountry of the South. Moreover, in every colony, two European cultural movements, the Enlightenment and Pietism, which we'll talk about in the second part of this topic, which is the First Great Awakening, changed the tone of intellectual and spiritual life. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, as the migrants and landless children of long-settled families moved inland, they sparked wars with the native peoples and with France and Spain, the other European powers vying for empire in North America. A generation of dynamic growth produced a decade of deadly warfare that would set the stage for a new era in American history. So in New England, the Puritans set out to create this yeoman society where everybody owns their own land, works for themselves, you don't have any tenant farmers. Well, eventually, New England's going to fill up as more and more settlers pour in there, particularly from that great migration of all the Puritans coming over. And that's going to lead to people heading west. By 1750, however, the region's rapidly growing yeoman population had settled most of the best farmland and threatened the future of that society and so forth. Okay, like I mentioned, we're going to cover the Enlightenment and Pietism, which is the First Great Awakening, in part two of this topic. So you can look right here. I've shown you this map before in a previous recorded lecture. It shows you the melting pot. Really, what a lot of sociologists call it is really like a tossed salad. It's just a bunch of different ingredients all together and so forth that's taking place. And so what you end up having is all these different groups, and you can see where some are going onto the backcountry. They're going to be the ones that have conflict with Native Americans. You can see where the slaves are settling as well, and so forth. So let's look at New England particularly. And remember, Maine is part of Massachusetts at this time. And then Vermont is kind of really a frontier still. It becomes a state later after the American Revolution. Puritan ideology placed the husband at the head of the household and accorded him almost complete control over his dependents. Women from an early age saw the subordinate role women had to men in Puritan society. Sons would receive land for their inheritance, while daughters usually received livestock or household goods. And throughout the colonies, and not just in New England, women assumed the role of dutiful helpmates to their husbands, as man and woman often worked side by side. Farm wives tended the garden that provided the family with fresh vegetables and herbs. They spun thread and yarn from flax or wool and wove it into cloth for shirts and gowns. And I love the warmness of wool, but man, that's got to get itchy. Let's see. They knitted sweaters and stockings, made candles and soap, churned milk into butter, and pressed curds into cheese, which is very popular. A good friend of mine in Wisconsin area that loves cheese curds. Fermented malt for beer, preserved meats, and mastered dozens of other household tasks. Their labor and skills were crucial to the rural household economy. Bearing and rearing children were equally important tasks, and most women in New England married in the early 20s, and by the early 40s had given birth to 6 or 7 children. Some statistics say that 8 to 10 while raising 6 to 8 to adulthood. Usually delivered with the help of a neighbor or a midwife, large families sap the physical and emotional strength of most mothers for 20 or more of their most active years. Midwife is somebody that, since they didn't have hospitals, where you have these triage units or whatever, like we did when my children were born. But midwives are professional women who they deliver babies. Usually more women than men became full members of Puritan congregations. According to revivalist Jonathan Edwards, many women became full members both because they feared the dangers of childbirth and because that status meant that their children may be baptized. As time went on, the size of farms shrank in long settled communities. Many couples chose to have fewer women. To have fewer women, have fewer children. And after 1750, having to say only 4 children allow them to do other tasks like make extra yarn, cloth, or cheese to exchange with neighbors or sell to shopkeepers, which raised the family standard of living. Nevertheless, women were not equals culturally legal at this time in New England. Some Quaker and Baptist churches allowed women to be spiritual leaders, but by the 1760s, most evangelical churches advocated traditional gender roles. Okay. Shows you where the majority of the slaves lived and so forth. So the leader of the family in colonial society was the husband. Okay. Sons would get the land, not the daughters or the wife. The daughters would receive livestock and household goods, but they wouldn't actually get the land, which was the most valuable property. And women worked side by side with their husbands and played very, very important roles. And by the way, you didn't really see divorces back then. Household chores, pregnancy, where they would raise a lot of kids. Okay, and women had higher church membership, which is still that way in the United States today. All right, the next topic with inheritance. This is very, very important. And someday, if your parents and so forth leave you anything in their will and so forth, you'll be dealing with inheritance. But most migrating Europeans wanted large farms that would provide subsistence for themselves and ample land for their children. Parents with small farms could not provide their offspring with land, so they placed them as indentured servants in more prosperous households. When the indentures ended at age 18 or 21, their propertyless sons faced a decades-long climb up the agricultural ladder. From laborer to tenant, finally to freeholder, sons and daughters in well-to-do farm families were luckier. They received a marriage portion when they reached the age of 23 to 25. The marriage portion, which was land, livestock, or farm equipment, which, by the way, farm equipment was very prized possessions, repaid children for their past labor and allowed parents to choose their children's partners, which they did not hesitate to do. Parent security during old age depended on the wise choice of son or daughter-in-law. Although children could refuse an acceptable match, they did not have the luxury of simply falling in love with whomever they pleased, which will change later in American history. Marriage under 18th century English common law was not a contract between equals. A bride relinquished to her husband the legal ownership of her land and her personal property. After his death, she received a dower, the right to use but not sell a third of the family's property. And the widow's death or remarriage canceled this use right, and her portion was divided among the children. The widow's property rights were subordinate to those of the family line, which stretched across the generations. It was the father's duty to provide inheritance for his children, and men who failed to do so lost status in the community. Some fathers willed the family farm to a single son, providing that their children or their other children with money. Apprenticeship contracts or uncleared frontier tracts are required the inheriting son to do so. Other yeomen moved their families to the frontier, where life initially was hard, but land for the children was cheap and abundant. These farmers' historic accomplishment was the creation of whole communities of independent property owners. So the fact more Americans own land per percentage of the population than pretty much anywhere else in the world at this time, which was incredible. But like I said, there was a shortage of land because New England's population is doubling every 25 years. As we're going to see a common trend throughout U.S. history, if they can't get cheap, affordable land in New England, they're going to go west. And when they go west, they're going to run into Native Americans, and that is going to lead to a continual cycle of conflict that we'll see in Module 2 and Module 3 in this course. Okay. These are the type of crops that they ate. So these Puritan colonies had about 100,000 people in 1700, but nearly 200,000 in 1725, so therefore doubling, and almost 400,000 by 1750. Land became much more scarce as farms were divided time and again. Because parents had less land, less to give their sons and daughters, they had less control over their children's lives. The system of arranged marriages broke down as young people engaged in premarital sex and used the urgency of pregnancy to win their father's permission to marry. Now, the vast majority of couples married this way, no, but it was increasing more than they had when the original Puritans came over. Throughout New England, the number of premarital conceptions rose dramatically from about 10% of firstborn children in the 1710s to more than 30% in the 1740s. So still the vast majority are having children after they get married. Families responded to the land shortage in a couple of ways. Like some had smaller families. They use various methods of birth control. We're not going to go into that because this is not a health class. Other families petitioned provincial government for frontier land grants and hacked new farms out of the forests of central Massachusetts, western Connecticut, and eventually New Hampshire and later Vermont. Still others use their small plots more productively, replacing traditional English crops of wheat and barley with high-yielding potatoes and Indian corn. Potatoes has got more calories per acre than any other crop. Gradually, New England changed from a grain to a livestock economy, becoming the major supplier of salted and pickled meat to the plantations of the West Indies. So good old-fashioned beef and pork. Families work together to be successful as well. Farmers share tools together and help contribute to a sense of good community in New England towns. They also practice a system of community exchange. Now, one of the things that New England also provided to West Indies was a lot of salted fish. Okay. Now let's look at the Middle Atlantic. The Middle Atlantic colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, along with Delaware, became home to peoples of differing origins, languages, and religions. I mentioned this before. I'm going to say it again. The Middle colonies are the most diverse region of the English colonies in North America, period. Okay. Scots, Irish, Presbyterians, English and Welsh Quakers, and German Lutherans and Moravians, Dutch Reformed Protestants, and others form ethnic and religious communities that coexisted uneasily with one another. Okay. Now, ample fertile land and a longer growing season, so that's big. Longer growing season means more harvest time and therefore more fruitful crops. So it had a longer growing season in New England. It attracted migrants because of that. And grain exports to Europe and West Indies financed their rapid settlement. Between 1720 and 1770, growing demand doubled the price of wheat. By increasing their exports of wheat, corn, flour, and bread, Middle Atlantic farmers brought prosperity to the region, which in turn attracted more settlers. Okay, and the population surged from 120 in 1720 to 450 in 1765. Now, New England, because the original Dutch settlers, you had big, large land plots, and the Iroquois Indians along the Mohawk River Valley, there's not going to be as much small Yeoman farmers, so to speak. There's going to be more tenant farmers. So in the Hudson River Valley, with these wealthy families owning vast tracts of land and manors, they were kind of like similar to the Chesapeake, plantation owners. These New York kind of wealthy farmers try to live and copy the European gentry, but few migrants wanted to labor as poor, dependent peasants. To attract tenants, the manorial lords had to grant them long leases and the right to sell their improvements, their houses and barns, for example, to the next tenant. Most tenant families hoped that with hard work and luck, they could sell enough wheat to buy their own farmsteads. But pre-industrial technology limited their output, especially during the crucial harvest season. With only a sickle to cut the wheat, it severely limited the acreage a farmer could plant in hopes of actually cultivating it. The cradle scythe helped triple the amount they could cut, but nothing like the grain reaper of the 1800s. We'll talk about Cyrus McCormick's grain reaper big time in when we get to the 1800s. Okay. All right, now Pennsylvania, or cold state. The wealth is more evenly distributed because that makes sense because you got the Quakers, okay, and they lived a very simple life. And the Quakers originally arrived with the same resources and lived simple in small houses, 1 or 2 rooms, and they had a sleeping loft, a few benches or stools, and some wooded trenchers, which are planters, and a few wooden noggins, which are cups. I got to witness this when I've toured cabins in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. You can see where they had this like one simple room, and then they had a loft where you would sleep right above it. That's kind of interesting. In time, however, the expanding trade in wheat and influx of poor settlers led to social divisions. By the 1760s, affluent eastern Pennsylvania farmers were using the labor of slaves and immigrant workers to grow wheat on large farms. Some bought up land or leased it out. Others made money by providing new settlers with farming equipment, sugar and rum from the West Indies, and financial services. Those that advanced themselves financially by building large stone houses and furnishing with nice furniture. On one half of the white population, the Middle Atlantic colonies owned no land and little personal property. Many Scots, Irish, and German immigrants came to Pennsylvania and hoped to become eventual landowners, but rising land prices made this much more difficult. Merchants and artisans took advantage of the ample supply of labor to organize an outwork system. They bought wool or flax from farmers and paid propertyless workers in land-poor farm families to spin it into yarn and weave it into cloth. Even with social and economic divisions, colonists in America had a great opportunity for advancements then in Europe. Okay. A lot of Scots Irish and Germans going to there. So in the middle colonies, they were not really a melting pot because they really held to their tightly to their traditions. In fact, Germans settled in distinctly German towns and were able to still continue to speak primarily German for up to 6 generations. That's incredible. Usually by third generation they've assimilated. So this created a patchwork of ethnically and religiously diverse communities. And in 1748, a traveler counted no fewer than 12 religious denominations in Philadelphia, including Anglicans, Baptists, Quakers, Swedish and German Lutherans, Mennonites, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and Roman Catholics. Migrants preserved their cultural identity by marrying within their own ethnic group and maintaining the customs of their native land. A major exception were the Huguenots, which are French Protestants, really are Calvinists. They were expelled from Catholic France in 1680s. They intermarried and lost their identity rather quickly. They're like probably the quickest assimilating immigrant group in American history. In Pennsylvania and western New Jersey, Quakers were the dominant social group at first because of their numbers and later because of their wealth and social cohesions. But because Quakers were pacifist, Pennsylvania officials dealt with Native Americans by negotiating treaties and buying land rather than seizing it. Thomas Penn did use dubious tactics to oust the Delaware Indians from a vast area of land, creating bitterness that would lead to a war in the 1750s. By this time, though, Quakers had begun to extend the religious values of equality and justice to African Americans. Many Quaker meetings, which were congregations, condemned the injustice institution of slavery, and some expelled members who continued to keep slaves. And later, their descendants are going to be abolitionists. Okay. Now, let's talk about German migration. About 100,000 left Germany, and there's a reason why they left Germany. You had war. There was many German provinces. And they were caught in a lot of the colonial wars or the European wars. There was forced military conscription. There were heavy taxes, a lot of religious persecution. This is where you start having the first German Jews come over, and also because of overcrowding. First to arrive in 1683 were the Mennonites, a group of religious dissenters drawn by the promise of religious freedom. I can't understate the importance of religious freedom and religious reasons why so many immigrants came over in American history. In the 1720s, overcrowding and religious upheaval in southwestern Germany and German-speaking cantons and Switzerland brought a larger wave of migrants. A third wave of Germans in Swiss, nearly about 40,000 strong, landed in Philadelphia between 1749 and 1756. Some of these newcomers were redemptioners, which were indentured servants who migrated as a family, but many more were property farmers and artisans in search of ample land for the children. Land, and more land is one of the big reasons why immigrants come over in American history. Germans soon dominated many districts of eastern Pennsylvania, and thousands more moved down to the Shenandoah Valley and to the western parts of Maryland. Shenandoah Valley is a beautiful valley, big, great farmland in Virginia. Well beyond 1800, these settlers spoke German, read German language newspapers, and conducted church services in German, and preserved German farming practices, which sent women to the fields to plow and reap. Germans also typically insisted that married women had the right to hold property and write wills. So that's interesting. Okay. Let's look at the Scots-Irish, which I have a little Scots-Irish ancestry. And my wife has got German ancestry. In fact, some of her on her dad's side were some of the earliest German settlers into Texas. Migrants from Ireland accounted for the largest group of incoming Europeans, about 115,000 in number. Although some were Irish and Catholic, most were Scots and Presbyterians because they were the Scots-Irish. They were basically Calvinist Protestants that were sent to Ireland by the English government to try to convert Ireland to Protestantism in the 1600s. It failed. The first migrants landed in Boston in the 1710s and settled primarily in New Hampshire. By 1720, though, most were selling to Philadelphia, attracted by the religious tolerance there, and it's also in search of cheap land on the frontier. They move inland to central Pennsylvania and to the fertile Shenandoah Valley, which stretched from Maryland down to North Carolina. They mostly settled on the frontier backcountry from Pennsylvania down to the Carolinas. And like the Germans, the Scotch-Irish retained their culture, living in ethnic communities and holding firm to the Presbyterian Church. They marched with the Paxton Boys against Philadelphia when they believed the Pennsylvania government was too lenient toward the Indians. This will be the last thing we're going to cover in this recorded lecture part before we get to the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. So religious sects enforce moral behavior through communal self-discipline. Quaker families attended a weekly worship meeting and a monthly discipline meeting. Every 3 months, a committee with a monthly meeting reminded each mother and father to provide their children with proper religious instruction. And the committee also supervised adult behavior. So they were pretty much a very moral society. Significantly, Quaker meetings granted permission to marry only to couples with land and livestock sufficient to support a family. So basically, if you couldn't afford a family, then you weren't supposed to get married. Poor Quakers married later or did not marry at all. These marriage rules helped build a self-contained and prosperous Quaker community, and they were very prosperous. And by the 1740s, with increased immigration, Quakers became the minority in Pennsylvania, with just about 30% of the population. The Scotch-Irish settlers in central Pennsylvania challenged the pacifism of the Quaker-dominated assembly by demanding an aggressive Indian policy, because the Scotch-Irish are the ones living on the frontier, and they're the ones getting killed by Indians. Okay. To maintain their influence, Quaker politicians looked for allies among the German migrants, many of whom embraced the Quakers' policy of pacifism and no compulsory military service. In return, German leaders demanded fair representation of their communities in the provincial assembly and legislation that respected their inheritance customs. Ethnic-based conflicts over Indian policy caused problems for Pennsylvania politics. All right, we will come to this part on the next one.